Hey, hope you're having a great day. This is Finx MTG here with a Commander deck tech for Kruphix, God of Horizons. I'll be going through the different cards of the deck and their main purposes. We're going to be using an Eldrazi Tribal deck to go with this commander. You're able to cast some spells and some creatures they would normally never get to cast in a normal commander game because the mana value, the mana cost is too high and you're not able to get there. This commander enables you to do it. We're going to be putting this at around a level 7 on a scale from 1 to 10 in terms of power. Again, there are better cards that you can put in here. This is where the deck is at right now. Kruphix, God of Horizons. 3 colorless, 1 green and blue, a Simic commander. The trick with this is that it is a legendary enchantment creature god. So although it's a 4/7 here, when it comes into play, it's actually just an enchantment that has indestructible. As long as your devotion to green and blue is less than 7, it isn't a creature. So basically with this deck, we're never turning this into a creature. It's just always remaining there. It's very difficult for the opponents to get rid of him. It also has a clause, you have no maximum hand size, and it allows you to do something in Magic that you're not supposed to be able to do. If unused mana would empty from your mana pool, that mana becomes colorless instead. You can bank mana on Kruphix here. So that enables you to tap lands on opponents' turns on the end of your turn and just float that mana until it is needed or until you want to cast a big spell on your turn. So of course, to do that and to enable our big spells to be cast, we actually need to play a lot of cards that can get us mana quickly. It becomes a ramp game. There's 2 ways to ramp in Magic. You know, you have your mana, your artifacts that create mana as one way to ramp, and you also have your green spells. Since we're in Simic and we have green, why not use the green spells to ramp here? And it's not susceptible to something like a Vandal Blast, which can wipe out all of that artifact mana. And there are a lot of artifacts that are super powerful. They're expensive cards, and it raises the power level of the deck. This one, Farseek. Search your library for, the other ones don't matter, but we're searching for an island, putting it onto the battlefield tapped. And again, if something says it's a forest island or island forest, you can grab it with these cards. That's why they're so good. 2 mana ramp. Nature's Lore from Ice Age. Search your library for any forest card, put it directly into play. This one comes in untapped, so if you need to, you can float mana with it, or you can use it for something else. Kodama's Reach, same as Cultivate. So basically, you're taking 1 basic land out of your deck, putting it onto the battlefield, and 1 into your hand. Just a traditionally good card for mana ramp. And we also have Nisa's Pilgrimage. So the benefit of this is that it's basically a Kodama's Reach or Cultivate, but this one, if you have Spell Mastery, meaning there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, you search your library for up to 3 basic forest cards instead of 2. So it's getting you a little bit more bang for your buck if you meet that criteria. And again, if you're casting these spells, you might have some in there as well in the graveyard to meet it. Skyshroud Claim, really like this one from the Nemesis block. 3 colorless and a green. Search your library for up to 2 forest cards and put them into play. Untapped, then shuffle. Very good. That one really gets you ahead when you get that into play. Tempt with Discovery. Now, a lot of players know how these voting cards work and the politicking cards, and they don't really want to give you that much value. On this one, 4 mana, you search your library for any land, put it onto the battlefield. So to start off with, usually you just go for a forest or an island. But if the next player decides that they vote for finding a land and putting it into play, you can also get another land and put it into play. And that's where you can start going for your utility lands if you so choose. And there is some discussions usually on this. You know, some people are running Field of the Dead or some other ridiculous lands that are utility value that you got to be careful with on this one. But that is how that one goes. We'll go through some of the lands later that you can grab with it. Harrow we have up next. This is a great card. As an additional cost to Harrow, though, you do have to sacrifice a land. So this is good because you can leave your mana open in case you need to hold up mana for a counterspell or something like that. The turn before you, on the player's end step, pay 3 mana, sacrifice your land, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. And it also puts them in untapped, so you can float the mana if Kruphix is on the board. Another great feature with Kruphix there. The only problem with this is sometimes people get a little antsy and they counterspell this, and that really sets you pretty far behind because, again, it's an additional cost when you cast the spell to sacrifice the land. It's not after it resolves. So even if it's countered, you still have to sacrifice it. Enough with that one. Urban Evolution, 3 colorless, a green and a blue. Draw 3 cards. And the big one, you may play an additional land this turn. So it is land ramping you. If you're drawing 3 cards, more than likely you will draw at least 1 land in there, and you can put it onto the battlefield. That's why that one's good. Versioning. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Okay, so this card is great if it's in your opening hand, because if you have this and say 3 lands in your hand, you're just dumping all your lands before your next turn. It's also great when you have something like a card like Mystic Remora, where you're going to be refilling your hand, and you can drop more lands into play as the turns go on. If you have this late in the game, maybe you drew a lot of cards with an X spell. You can also use this to then ramp those cards out of your hand. Again, Kruphix gives us no maximum hand size. So you have all those lands sitting in your hand. This is a way to get them out into play because people are not going to stop playing lands. Wilderness Reclamation is a nice little combo with your commander. 3 mana, 3 colorless, and a green. Enchantment, at the beginning of your end step, untap all lands you control. And the benefit of this is that you can tap out for everything you need on your turn. At the end of your turn, untap all of your lands, and then you can either leave them open for counterspells, or you can tap them again to float mana on Kruphix. Usually you'd want to leave it open until the player before you's end step, and then tap those lands and float the mana on Kruphix. And again, if you got this out on turn 6 or turn 5 or 6, you can be floating 5 or 6 mana before it gets to your turn. So on your turn, you're going to have around 12 mana. This is a great card, and it will be targeted by the opponents if they realize what is going on. Next up, we have Seedborn Muse, which has a very similar effect. It's 5 mana, but this time you untap all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. And this works in other popular decks like the Kinnan deck, which is a bit more powerful than this one here and is also an alternative commander to this deck. But Seedborn Muse allows you to, each turn, tap all your lands, float all of that mana. Let's say you had 6 mana in play. You float 6 mana on the next player's turn. Then it goes to the next one. They untap all their stuff. You untap all your stuff. And you can tap again on their end step to float another 6 mana. By the time it gets to your turn, I've lost count of how much mana you can possibly get with this. But it can be game ending once you get this on the board. We do also have some amazing artifacts in the deck. It's not the primary focus, as you can see with how many different land spells we have here that we were pumping out. We have Thran Dynamo. So Thran Dynamo, to start with, great card from Urza's Destiny. Add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool by tapping them. Costs 4 colorless to get into play. Really good when we're playing colorless spells. And next up, we have a revised edition Mana Vault. So this card is great because Kruphix is 3 colorless mana to get out. So if you play your Mana Vault on turn 1 or 2, turn 3, you're getting Kruphix into play. You don't really need to untap him until later on, and you can do it at your leisure because you're, again, floating mana when you need to. Works really well. It is a little bit higher power level, but I like it because it goes so well with the commander. Next up, Skyclave Relic. 3 mana indestructible, taps for 1 mana of any color. The big thing here is that you can use the kicker cost if you get it later in the game. And when you play the 3 mana kicker cost, so a total of 6 mana, you make 2 tap tokens that are copies of it that are also indestructible. So for 6 mana, you're getting 3 artifacts that can each tap for 1, generating 3 total mana of any one color, or of any color on each of those. Everflowing Chalice. When you banked up a lot of mana, you can pour it into this with the Multi-Kicker 2. So for each charge counter you put on it, and that's each time you did a Multi-Kicker, you can add 1 colorless to your mana pool. So as you can see, with this type of deck, you can make this a huge chalice, a really overflowing chalice. Next up, Sol Ring, just because it's in every deck ever made. Arcane Signet, for pretty much the same reason. So right there, we have a number of different land ramp spells and a few artifacts to really get us going. But what's the end goal with this? What do we do with all this mana? Well, there's a couple things. One of them is our payoff spells and card draw. So if you're dumping all those cards out of your hand, you're going to need to draw some extra cards. One of the options, Blue Sun Zenith, 3 blue X, target player draws X cards, shuffle Blue Sun Zenith into its owner's library. I have used this to mill out opponents on occasion. But the big item here is that it shuffles back into your library after you use it. So you use it to refill your hand with whatever mana you have, and then hopefully you can draw into it again. Remember, it's an instant. It costs a little bit more. It's 1 extra blue than normal, but you can cast it on an opponent's end step. So right before your turn, you're drawing into all those cards, which really helps out. Then we have Pull from Tomorrow. Notice this one is only 2 blue, still an instant. The drawback here is that you discard a card. Draw X cards, discard a card. Finale of Revelation. This one's a sorcery, but it has added benefits. If X is 10 or more, instead shuffle your graveyard into your library. Sometimes you need to do that. And then you draw the X cards, and you untap up to 5 lands, which is really big. And you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So you can play this and still have counter magic up for opponents' turns. It's not basically spending all of your turn and giving it up, and then you just have to see what happens from the opponents. Finale of Devastation is one of the payoff spells. So if you're casting this, you should be winning the game. This is the game finisher here. Search your library and or graveyard for a creature card with mana cost, converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield. If X is 10 or more, which it should be with Kruphix, remember you're banking all the mana, creatures you control get +X and gain haste until end of turn. Haste is the big deal there, so you can have all your items attack right away. Savala's Stampede, another type of voting card here, but this is a payoff because it allows you to put at least, you're going to have at least 2 Eldrazi usually in your hand when you cast this card. And when an opponent says wild or free, if it's wild, it's from the top of your library until you hit a creature card and you put that onto the battlefield. If it's free, it's from your hand. So usually for yourself, you'll vote wild, so the opponents will usually vote free, and you put whatever's in your hand onto the board, and you put something from the top of your library. You don't get the added effects of the Eldrazi for being cast, but you're ending up with huge creatures on the battlefield. Next up, we have Genesis Wave. 3 green X. Reveal the top cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. You can be doing X for 10 to 12. Then put all the cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield into your graveyard. Don't really care about that when you get, 5 Eldrazi on the battlefield or something like that. And just in case you need to go find one of those cards, we have a nice Mirage Mystical Tutor to search for one of those. It can also be used to find a counterspell if you're in a situation where you know the opponent's going to be going for their win con on their turn. Or if you need to draw more cards, you can get one of those big draw card payoff spells. You also have card draw in this deck. We showed you the Mystic Remora here. So we have the ability to draw this one. You can just keep it going as long as you can. You're not putting a lot of heavy pressure on early on with this deck. You need to build up a little bit. You have Tatyova Benthic Druid. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Gaining life is nice to keep you in the game because you're going to be taking a lot of damage when people realize you're Eldrazi Tribal and what you're trying to do here. But the draw card is huge because you need to refill your hand. Fact or Fiction, it's a voting card where it's not a voting card. The other person gets to decide 2 piles, and you get 1 into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Brainstorm, draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library. This is when you really need to fish for something and you're trying to get it with that. And Cyclonic Rift, which is also a finisher. This has nothing to do with draw, but I had it in the draw pile. You return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. You're only playing that if it's going to stop somebody from winning the game. The main reason is on somebody else's end step, you're paying 7 mana to overload, returning all non-land permanents the opponent's control to their hand. They are left with nothing, you are left with everything, and you can win on your turn or you can pull ahead in the game and take it out from there. So let me see some of the cards that we want to play once we have all this mana, all these abilities, and all this card draw. An Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. That's the kind of stuff we want to see, right? A 10/10. When you cast this for 10 mana, you exile 2 target permanents. It has Indestructible. And when he attacks, the defending player exiles the top 20 cards of his or her library. If this attacks once or twice, you might be exiling a lot of the opponent's win cons. Let me make some room here on the board. We have a Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. Next up, we have other Eldrazi here. We have a Bane of Balaged. So this card, I did switch this out. I had a Void Winnower in here before, but that was a little bit of a higher power level and a little bit of a saltier card because the opponent can't play half of their deck. This one it doesn't seem that good, but when it attacks, defending player exiles 2 permanents he or she controls. Because we have a lot of land ramp in here, we're getting to this 7 mana pretty quickly, and this can attack and do some damage. Excuse me. Okay, so Desolation Twin. 10 mana for a 10/10. When you cast Desolation Twin, put a 10/10 colorless Eldrazi token onto the battlefield. If they can't handle one 10/10, how about handling 2 10/10s that you got on the battlefield? Worldbreaker. 6 and a green. When you cast him, you exile target artifact, enchantment, or land, which is very big because you need that type of removal in here for exiling something the opponent has. It has reach, which also helps. But the big thing is you can bring it back from the graveyard by paying 2 and a colorless, sacrifice a land, return it from your graveyard to your hand. It That Betrays. Annihilator 2, 11/11 for 12 mana. When an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control, which is huge in a deck with cards with Annihilator, which this has because it's Eldrazi. Speaking of which, we go to Pathrazer of Ulamog, 9/9 for 11 mana. Annihilator 3. When this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 3 permanents. And if you have It That Betrays on the battlefield, that means that you're getting those permanents, which is huge. The reason why I like Pathrazer of Ulamog is because cannot be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So what that does is, a lot of times they'll get little chump blockers out and you're like, oh man, how am I going to get through for the combat damage for the win? And the way is you go right around it because they can't get enough creatures sustained to block this guy. Oblivion Sower, 6 mana, but it exiles the top 4 core cards of the opponent's library, of an opponent's library. And you can put any number of lands that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. So there's some decks that also play exile type strategies, and you can steal any of the lands that they had exiled, not just the ones that are shown from this. So not only is this a very good land ramp that also puts a big creature that they would have to get through to hurt you on the battlefield, but it has some little quirky little abilities there as well. Artisan of Kozilek, 9 mana, 10/9. When you cast them, you can return a target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So even if they can sometimes deal with your Eldrazi, you can bring them back. Also has Annihilator 2. Endbringer, 5 and a colorless. Untap Endbringer during each other player's untap step. So that's the big thing. We have a lot of different artifacts and lands that can specifically produce colored mana, which is required for this. Remember, the 5 is mana of any color or colorless, but this other symbol means it has to be colorless mana. So, Endbringer deals 1 damage to target creature or player. You can target different items on the board to ping with that each turn. Then you can do target creature can't attack or block this turn to make sure that your Eldrazi go through and they won't be able to block with their card. Or you can refill your hand on each opponent's turn. Kozilek the Great Distortion. This card's amazing when it comes into play. It's a 12/12 menace for 10 mana, but it allows you to discard a card with mana cost X, counter target spell with mana cost X. So if you have one of these big payoff spells where you drew a lot of cards, you can pretty much discard whatever you have in your hand to counter any major win cons or any major answers that the opponents can play. And the best part of this is, even if you don't have any cards in your hand, you draw up to 7 cards when you cast this with the first ability. So this is a great card all around. Darksteel Colossus. I did not have the Blightsteel Colossus in this. This one's a little bit less spicy, a little bit less salty. The Blightsteel Colossus is Trample and Infect, which can single-shot opponents. This one is still 11/11, indestructible, has Trample. When it dies, it doesn't go into your graveyard, it shuffles back into your library so people can't mill you out. And we're going for a combat damage win, so this felt a little bit more appropriate for this type of deck than the other one. Then we have Steel Hellkite, which is not an Eldrazi, but it's a 5/5 flying, and when it hits the opponents, let's say it hits somebody that has some stacks pieces or some pieces on the board that are preventing you from really going off or winning. You can destroy each non-land permanent with mana cost X whose controller was dealt damage by this card for the turn. So that's pretty good ability right there to give you some removal. We also have not just these awesome creatures that are huge, we have cards like Ugin the Spirit Dragon, my favorite planeswalker here that is just ridiculous when it comes out on the board. It's 8 colorless mana to cast. The +2 ability deals 3 damage to target creature or player. which you can start pinging people right away if you want. But the main ability that I end up using this for is usually a lot's going on the board by the time I get this cast. And you do the -X, exile each permanent with mana cost X or less that's one or more colors. Again, most of our permanents are going to be colorless, and we can afford to lose an enchantment or something like that if it is on the board. You can minus this 5, pretty much wipe the board, and still have him out with 2 loyalty as he starts with 7. And then you can start ticking him up. And again, if you're already in a good position on the board and you're not threatened in that way, you can just start ticking him up. If you get to the -10 ultimate, you gain 7 life, draw 7 cards, then put up to 7 permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. So that means by your next attack phase of the next turn, you should be winning the game if that goes off. It's very hard to lose once that goes off. We also have Ugin the Ineffable. Another version of Ugin. This one's 6 colorless with 4 loyalty, and it has 2 very good abilities, 3 very good abilities for us. Colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. All of your flying artifact creatures, all of your Eldrazi, all cost 2 less to cast that are going to be coming in and making a big impact. The +1, if you're running low on cards in hand, you exile the top card of your library, it becomes a 2/2 creature, and then you can chump block with it, or if somebody has a board wipe, when those die, those cards go to your hand. So it's effectively card draw when you need it. Then you have -3, destroy target permanent, that's 1 or more colors. So again, if there's anything on the board that you really have to deal with, you can target it with that there. So we have the Ugins rounding out our Planeswalker package here. Going into some of the other items, the board state does get kind of crazy. So we have cards like Aether Spouts. Now this is an instant. For each attacking creature, its owner puts it on the top or bottom of his or her library. It costs 5 mana. It is a lot, but in this deck, again, you're banking mana and you can cast it. And the big thing is here that this sets them back because if they choose to keep the creature on the top of their library, then that's going to slow down their game plan because they're not drawing new cards, they're drawing into cards that they had already played. So it's kind of like the old card Plow Under, which really sets people back. And again, you do not have to use this unless they are specifically attacking you. Otherwise, you can just let them attack and deal damage, and whatever happens, happens. Great card. All is Dust. Each player sacrifices all colored permanents they control for 7 colorless mana. This is great because although we would be suffering from sacrificing the Kruphix, God of Horizons commander, it pretty much board wipes everybody else on the board. And if we already have Eldrazi out, everybody will have their board cleared, and we have Eldrazi ready to attack and ready to go. Very good board wipe in this deck. The other board clearing items, we have Flood of Tears, 6 mana, return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control, then you can put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So this works really well because if you have some artifacts or enchantments on the board, he returns them to your hand, and then you can drop out a giant Eldrazi, and it effectively makes you get him out many turns earlier than you would normally be able to because this is, again, only 6 mana. Aetherize. This one, again, you can save until when you're being attacked, and I've won games because people have creatures that may be indestructible or can't be targeted, and you're going to die unless you have a card like this in your hand. And what this one does is it returns all attacking creatures to their owner's hands. So you can wait until they're attacking you for lethal damage and then cast this card, and it usually sets them back several turns and keeps you alive. And again, you need to draw out the game a little bit to gain some time to be able to play your big creatures with the mana banked on Kruphix and be doing your land ramp early on. So those were the giant board wipes that we had. We had 4 main ones there, but we also have single target removal such as Pongify. Destroy target creature makes it a 3/3. We have Beast Within because there's always those people that play lands like Field of the Dead, which you have to watch when they're doing the temp with Discovery, and they can get cards like that. You need something because somebody always to play those cards that you just have to deal with. Destroy any permanent. They get a 3/3 beast. Predator Flagship. This is great in this deck and is a lot of fun. 5 mana artifact from the Nemesis block. Also very cool artwork. Again, this is the one that was fighting the Weatherlight in the lore and captured the Weatherlight. But anyway, target creature gains flying until end of turn for 2 mana. So that can be used on your Eldrazi when they want to attack to make them have evasion. But the big one here, 5 tap, destroy target creature with flying. 7 mana, you can destroy any creature on the board. Pretty good with Kruphix banking mana. Then we go into your typical counter spells. We are in blue here. I love the artwork from Commander Legends on the borderless card here for counter spell, standard staple. Oh, we're revealing cards early. Sublime Epiphany. 6 mana, choose one or more. So you can just choose all of these. Target player draws a card. So you draw a card. You counter the spell that the opponent was playing to try and win the game. You could also counter target activated or triggered ability if they were trying to win the game with that. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand to set a player back. And a big one, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. So you can copy your Eldrazi, counter their big spell, return a permanent to their hand, draw an extra card to replace this, and it's great because you have the mana's being banked anyway, and it costs 6, which is intimidating in a normal deck, but not in this one. Swansong, just another great counterspell that is in here. Pact of Negation. So we do not have, I did have Force of Will in this deck at one point in time, and it was a little bit higher power level. Right now we have the Pact of Negation as our only free counters, well, our second to last free counterspell here. Because again, at the beginning of your next upkeep, you do have to pay 5 or you lose the game. So make sure you have the mana available in terms of lands, because they could also kill Kruphix or something like that, and you don't have the mana that you banked to carry over it, or they can kill your artifacts. I've seen it happen. I've seen people lose from that. The other free counterspell, Fierce Guardianship. I had this from when it first came out, and it wasn't so big, but it's just a great card, and with your commander, sometimes you need something like this. Commander's almost always on the board, so it's great to be able to counter target non-creature spell whenever you want for free. Last up, Mana Drain. So this is a great counterspell card in this deck because you are banking the mana that you get, so you don't even have to spend it on your turn if you don't want to. But again, you need those 6 mana hits where you're countering a 6 mana creature or commander, and then you're banking that mana for yourself to cast an Eldrazi or a payoff spell. So we have a lot of great cards here. And then moving into some of the other cards that have nice little tricks and synergies and just other items that are in the deck. We have Nezahal Primal Tide. This card is 7 mana, 7/7, can't be countered. Also gives you no maximum hand size in case you don't have your commander out. This also has the same effect. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you draw a card. So this is great at refilling your hand when you need to, and it's an intimidating creature to have on the board. But you can also discard 3 cards, and then you exile him and then bring him back at the end step. So it's very hard for the opponents to remove him from the battlefield once he's on the battlefield, and they'll usually waste resources on this, which is better than them targeting your Eldrazi, which will actually close out the game. Again, this will maybe draw you cards, but it's not going to close out the game by itself. Then we have a Goreclaw Terror of Kalsisma, something like that. So this card is good because we need to get through with combat damage, and sometimes you need a trample enabler. When you attack with this guy and your other big Eldrazi, it gives creatures with power 4 or greater +1/+1, and they gain trample until end of turn. So that's great to have. It also makes your creature spells with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. This is an early item that you can get out and get set up for your big Eldrazi. Garruk's Uprising is another card that enables trample. When it comes onto the battlefield, you have a creature that's bigger than 4 power. You draw a card, and whenever you cast one that's bigger than 4 power, you draw a card. So it does everything we need to do on that one. Eldrazi Monument. There's only a couple ways to actually gain life in this deck, so it's very important to be able to come back when we're low on life. This one, 5 mana, colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Good, because we're all colorless stuff. Whenever you tap a permanent for 1 colorless, add an additional 1. Again, that works on your lands that tap for colorless mana and your artifacts, which is great, and you can bank it on Kruphix. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life, and that's the other item there that keeps you in the game. Next up, we have Lightning Greaves, because it's great to give a 10/10 Eldrazi with Annihilator a haste ability and Shroud so that he can't be targeted. This is very powerful when it's on the board. And another haste enabler, we have Crashing Drawbridge, which is a bit of a meme card, but I like it because it comes out as a 0/4 blocker. There's a lot of people that have those little creatures that if they deal damage to you, that can something, well, Ragavan's pretty powerful, but something like Ragavan, right? They're getting value out of it. You want to be able to block those little guys. So you can play this early, and mid-game to late game, giving your creatures haste is huge. Imagine playing a Genesis Wave after you have this and putting 4 Eldrazi into play, giving them all haste. It's a lot of fun, a pretty crazy card from Throne of Eldraine here. Then we have Rite of Replication. So Rite of Replication works really well in this deck because normally you could just copy one card, but that's not that great. What if you kick it for 5? So a total of 9 mana, and you put 5 copies of one of your Eldrazi onto the board. And then you pretty much win the game on your next attack step when they do not have Summoning Sickness. So that one right there can close out the game as well. And we have a hidden card here, Psychosis Crawler from, I believe, Scars of Mirrodin set for 5 mana. This one is good for the payoff spells that draw a lot of cards that have X in the value, because whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. It also becomes very high power and toughness as it equals the amount of cards in your hand. So it can end up being like 10 or higher power and toughness that you can swing with as well. And that's the main cards that are in the deck and the main synergies that you have. There are also, of course, the land cards, some of which are more important than others, but I'll just go over a few of them here, not all of them. So we'll put some of the basic lands over here. And we have Mosswort Bridge. Hideaway. Comes into play tapped, but you exile one of the top 4 cards face down under this. If you have creatures totaling power 10 or greater, tap 1 green and this, and you can play that card without paying its casting cost, which is huge to play an Eldrazi for 1 green mana. Then we have a Sanctum of Ugin, which should be in any deck that features Eldrazi. It adds 1 colorless to your mana pool, but when you cast a colorless spell with converted mana cost 7 or greater, you sacrifice this card, and pretty much always sacrifice it. If you do, search for a colorless creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So you play your 1 giant Eldrazi, and this one gets the next giant Eldrazi up in the on-deck circle. I love this card, and it always works really well, but you have to remember when you cast that card to enact this triggered ability here, because sometimes you can forget about it and you miss the opportunity. Blast Zone, another way to get rid of some of the smaller guys on the board or some stacks pieces. You put charge counters on it, and then you blow up everything equal to the charge counters on it. One weakness with this deck is Voltron-type strategies. You can deal with a lot of cards by returning them to their hand if there's like a lot of creatures or tokens or such items coming at you, such creatures. This Maze of Ith is if a Voltron commander comes at you, you can take it out of combat and it doesn't deal damage to you. Otherwise, you might be taking that 21 commander damage before you're ready and before you can fend it off. Then we have the Tron lands. I originally had ways to get these Tron lands. You know, you had like a Moonsilver Key or Expedition map you had in here to be able to get them. Then I realized it's not really that important to try and get them in that manner. I kind of have them in here. The Template Discovery, you can just grab all 3 of these cards if you wanted to. You could grab the Maze of Ith, the Sanctum of Ugin if you want. But once you have all 3 of these in play, you can tap them all for a total of 7 mana. These are the ones from Chronicles here with the white border. But it's just fun to play these cards when you actually get them into play. It doesn't happen too often when you're not specifically looking for it, like you wouldn't be in this deck, but it's fun to have here. And Radiant Fountain. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life, tap for colorless. So you just have a card like this to just kind of keep you in the game here a little bit longer. And we have some other standard lands that are going to be in here. And a whole bunch of forests and islands. So again, the idea with this deck is to play some big Eldrazi that you really want to get into play. You can't cheat them into play all the time because then you lose out on the effects. Reliquary Tower, unique because no maximum hand size in case your commander gets out of play. But you can play some huge creatures. You can play some draw X spells and draw the majority of your deck, which is always a lot of fun. A lot of different ways you can build this Kruphix deck. This is one particular model here with an Eldrazi Tribal. Hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Have a good one.